major provocative arguments challenging religious belief at its core. We're diving right in.
Yeah, straight into the deep end. Our mission today really is to cut through some of the noise, distill the key arguments from these sources.
We'll be looking at the philosophical side, the whole question of a creator, but also where morality comes from and the social impact of religion.
Exactly. And maybe before we jump in, it's worth just acknowledging the landscape. It's not always easy being a skeptic, especially in some places.
Right, you're talking about that Gallup poll, the one from 1999. It's striking data, particularly for the U.S.
It really is. It showed atheists had, well, surprisingly low social standing. The poll asked if people would vote for an otherwise qualified candidate who happened to be, say, Catholic.
And that was fine. 95% said yes.
Then Mormon, 79% yes. Homosexual, also 79% yes.
But for an atheist, only 49%, less than half. It really puts the acceptance level way back maybe where acceptance for gay people was decades earlier.
It highlights why these discussions can feel so, well, intense. It's pushing against a strong current.
Okay, so with that context set, let's get into the main themes. First, why science suggests maybe there's no need for a God. And second, this idea that we don't actually need God to be good people.
Let's start with that first one, the philosophical challenge based on complexity, the ultimate Boeing 747 idea.
Ah, yes, the argument from improbability or design. Explain that a bit.
Well, the basic idea from design proponents is look at something complex like a watch or even life itself. It must have had a designer, right? It couldn't just happen.
Okay, seems intuitive enough on the surface.
But here's the catch.
Huh.
If you follow that logic, then the designer, God in this case,
Yes.
must be even more complex than the universe he supposedly designed.
And then who designed the designer? You get stuck in this infinite loop, this explanatory regression.
Exactly. It doesn't actually explain anything. The sources call this a skyhook, something that just magically appears to solve the problem, rather than a crane like natural selection.
A crane being something that builds complexity gradually from simpler beginnings. Natural selection does that.
Precisely. It works incrementally. A complex designer just pushes the problem back a step without solving it. It's an intellectual shortcut, really.
Now, I know theologians have a way around this, or they try to. They say God isn't complex, God is simple.
Right. The simplicity assertion. It's an attempt to break that regression. But the sources we looked at, they tackle this head on, actually using an argument from a philosopher of religion, Richard Swinburne, but kind of turning it on its head.
How so?
Well, Swinburne argued that the sheer consistency of the universe, every electron behaving exactly the same way everywhere all the time, that requires constant divine management. Billions upon billions of particles kept perfectly in line.
Okay, but wait. If God is actively managing every single particle, ensuring identical behavior second by second across the cosmos, that sounds like the opposite of simple.
That's the contradiction. It sounds like the most complex, demanding, ongoing management task imaginable. So the idea of God being simple just doesn't seem to hold up under that kind of scrutiny.
So it creates this internal tension. The complexity argument seems to lead to a dead end.
And when that happens, the argument often shifts slightly, away from pure complexity towards probability, the fine-tuning argument.
Ah, the idea that the universe's physical constants, gravity, the forces within atoms are just too perfect for life to have arisen by chance. It feels designed.
Yes, but the counter to that, the statistical or anthropic hypothesis, it relies on sheer scale. We're talking about a conservative estimate of maybe a billion planets out there. A billion.
It's a lot of chances.
An almost inconceivable number. Life, or the conditions for it, only needed to arise once, on just one of those planets. With those kinds of numbers, events that seem incredibly improbable on Earth become, well, almost statistically likely somewhere.
It's like that firing squad analogy, right? The person who survives knows they survived because, well, they're there to tell the tale. But that doesn't mean they immediately assume divine intervention saved them.
Exactly. You still look for a mechanism. Were the guns faulty? Was it just sheer luck? We are here, so we know life arose, but that fact alone doesn't automatically point to design over probability and natural processes. We still seek the how.
And often when science doesn't immediately have the how, that's when you hear about the God of the gaps.
Yes. Any gap in current scientific understanding may be the exact trigger for the Cambrian explosion, or a specific fossil link gets presented as positive evidence for God.
It's like that joke from Michael Shermer you mentioned. If scientists find a fossil that fills a gap, the creationist just says, great, now there are two gaps, one on either side.
Precisely. It treats absence of evidence as evidence of absence for science,
Yeah.
but somehow evidence for the supernatural. It assumes God is the default answer, rather than just acknowledging we don't know yet. Science keeps filling those gaps, though.
Okay, so that covers the existence part. Let's shift gears to morality. The big question, the classic religious debate stopper. If there's no God, why be good?
Ah, yes. It's framed as a real singer, but it's actually a bit of a rhetorical trap.
How so?
Well, think about it. If someone says, yeah, without God watching, I'd probably rob, rape, and murder, what if they just told you about their own morality?
That they're basically only good because they're scared of punishment or hoping for reward, not inherently good.
Exactly. But if they say, no, of course I'd still be good, I wouldn't want to harm others, then they've just admitted God isn't actually necessary for their morality. They've undermined their own point.
Right, so if morality isn't divinely handed down, where does it come from? The sources argue for deep evolutionary roots, right? Darwinian roots.
Absolutely. Long before organized religion, altruism and cooperation provided real survival advantages. The sources break it down into about 4 main drivers.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's kin altruism. Pretty straightforward. We help our relatives, those who share our genes. Taking care of your kids, your siblings, it helps propagate your own genetic material.
Makes sense. What's next?
Second, reciprocal altruism. Basically, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Cooperation, trade, mutual support. If I help you today, you're more likely to help me tomorrow when I need it. It builds trust and benefits everyone involved.
The foundation of society, really. Okay, third.
Third is reputation. Being known as someone who is reliable, fair, and cooperative is hugely beneficial, evolutionarily speaking. Others are more likely to trust you, trade with you, help you out. A good reputation pays dividends.
So being seen as good helps you survive and thrive. And the fourth one.
This one's fascinating. Costly signaling. Think of it as showing off your fitness, but through generosity. Like a strong bird feeding unrelated subordinates. It's not just being nice. It's a costly, hard-to-fake signal saying, look how capable and resource-rich I am. It can enhance status and attract mates.
So altruism itself can be a display of strength. Okay, those 4 make sense for small, ancient groups. But how does that explain, say, donating anonymously to tsunami victims on the other side of the world? There's no kin, no direct reciprocity, no reputation boost, no obvious signaling.
That's where the sources talk about a kind of misfiring, or maybe a blessed error. Our evolved rules of thumb for kindness, help kin, help those who will help you back, were designed for small group living.
But now,
Now, in our globalized world, those same impulses get triggered by images of suffering strangers far away. The underlying mechanism fires, even though the original evolutionary logic doesn't strictly apply. It's like our empathy circuits are overgeneralizing in a really wonderful way.
a blessed error, I like that. And there's actual experimental evidence for this innate morality, isn't there? Mark Hauser's work.
Yes, his psychological experiments using moral dilemmas like the famous runaway trolley problem, do you flip
Yeah.
the switch to save 5 people but kill 1? He found remarkable consistency. About 90% of people, regardless of background, make the same basic choices.
But the really crucial part was comparing religious people and atheists, right?
That was key. When they compared the moral judgments of devoutly religious people and lifelong atheists on these dilemmas, they found no statistical difference. None.
Wow. So our fundamental moral intuitions seem to be universal, hardwired perhaps, and not actually dependent on believing in God or reading specific holy books.
That's what the evidence strongly suggests. And this difference in where morality comes from, innate versus revealed scripture, leads to very different approaches when tackling complex ethical issues like, say, abortion.
You get that clash between what the sources call religious absolutism and secular consequentialism.
Exactly. The absolutist approach tends to focus on definitions and rules.
Mm-hmm.
Is a fetus human? Does a sacred text forbid this action? This kind of thinking led extremists like Paul Hill or Michael Bray to argue that killing an abortion doctor was morally the same as destroying an early embryo.
Because both violated an absolute divine command, in their view. The status of the entity was paramount.
Right. Whereas the secular consequentialist perspective sets aside those labels and asks different questions. What are the actual consequences? Is there suffering involved? Can the entity feel suffering?
So they'd contrast the neurological capacity of an early embryo, maybe comparable to a tadpole, with the consciousness, feelings, hopes, and fears of the adult doctor.
Precisely. The focus shifts entirely to the capacity for suffering and the real-world impact, rather than adherence to a predefined absolute rule based on metaphysical status.
Okay, let's move on to the social and psychological side. One point that really jumped out was this call to reconsider how we talk about children and religion.
Yes, the consciousness raiser. The author urges us to consciously flinch, just internally, whenever we hear phrases like Catholic child or Muslim child.
Why the flinch?
Because children are too young to have formed reasoned beliefs about complex systems like economics or politics or indeed cosmology and religion. Labeling them this way assigns them an identity based on their parents' beliefs, not your own understanding.
So the preferred language is
Child of Muslim parents or child of Catholic parents. It's a subtle shift, but the hope is it acknowledges the belief comes from the family environment, not the child intrinsically. It leaves space for the child later in life to examine those beliefs and choose whether to adopt or reject them freely.
it respects their future intellectual autonomy, and failing to do this, or worse, instilling religious fear early on can cause real harm.
Definitely. The sources detail significant psychological damage. There's a harrowing story of a woman who felt traumatized for decades by the fear of hell instilled in her as a child. She actually rated it as worse than childhood sexual abuse she also experienced.
That's incredibly severe.
And apparently not isolated. There are support groups, like one run by Jill Mitten mentioned in the sources, specifically for people recovering from religious trauma and fear, particularly the terror of eternal damnation.
It highlights a real, tangible cost. And beyond fear, there's the social cost, the isolation.
Yeah, the anecdote about the young American medical student was telling. He comes out as an atheist to his girlfriend.
And her immediate reaction is distrust. She questions his ethics simply because they aren't God-based.
Right. It shows how deeply ingrained the suspicion of atheists still is in some parts of society. That lack of belief is seen by some as a fundamental lack of moral grounding, leading to immediate social stigma.
Which brings us to that tricky point about moderate religion. Critics often get asked, why focus on moderate believers? Isn't extremism the real problem?
It's a common question. But the argument presented is that moderate religion, however well-intentioned, unintentionally makes the world safe for fundamentalism.
How does it do that?
By teaching as a core value that faith belief without or even against evidence is a virtue. Once you establish that unquestioning faith is good and admirable, you create fertile ground for more literalist, extremist interpretations to take root. You've essentially disabled the critical thinking needed to challenge them.
So the virtue of faith itself becomes the gateway.
That's the argument. And you see the potential end result, tragically, in cases like the 2005 London bombers. Their motivation wasn't just political grievance, though that played a role. It was fundamentally driven by a literal belief they were martyrs, heading straight to paradise. They took their faith seriously.
Their actions become perfectly logical within their belief system, however horrifying to outsiders.
Exactly. And this deference to faith, even moderate faith, can sometimes warp public institutions, especially education. This force has called it diversity gone mad.
You're talking about the example of the UK's science department head.
Yeah, head of science at a state-funded school arguing that flood geology, Noah's Ark literally explaining Earth's geology, should be taught alongside, or maybe even instead of, established science like plate tectonics and continental drift.
Teaching that the entire geological record was laid down in a single global flood, instead of, evidence showing continents drifting apart at the speed your fingernails grow.
In a science class, it's presented under the banner of respecting religious diversity, but it ends up prioritizing religious narratives over demonstrable scientific fact, potentially harming the children's actual education and understanding of the world.
It shows how powerful that pressure to accommodate faith can be, even when it directly contradicts well-established scientific consensus.
So putting it all together, we've looked at the logical knots in the design argument. We've explored a strong evolutionary basis for why humans are generally good to each other. And we've touched on some of the real-world costs, both personal and societal, of unquestioned belief.
And I think the key takeaway, or at least a powerful one, is about the joy of scientific discovery. You mentioned Douglas Adams finding the awe in understanding natural selection far surpassed any religious awe. He said, "I'd take the awe of understanding over the awe of ignorance any day."
That really resonates. That awe of understanding pushes us beyond our biological limits. Our brains, after all, evolved for survival in what the sources call middle world, a very narrow slice of reality in terms of size, speed, and probability.
Right, which is why things like quantum physics or vast geological time or the sheer improbability of life arising feels so weird, so counterintuitive to us.
We need reason. We need science. to grasp realities far beyond the scale our everyday experience prepared us for. Relying only on intuition or ancient texts keeps us stuck in that middle world.
It's only by using evidence, not just comfort or tradition, that we can glimpse how truly strange and wonderful the universe actually is.
Which leads nicely to that final thought, that quote from J.B.S. Haldane. Now, my own suspicion is that the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. Reality likely outstrips even our wildest imaginations.
A fantastic challenge to leave things on. What do you, listening, believe about the world? And crucially, is that belief grounded in the best available evidence or in what feels comfortable? Lots to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into your sources. We hope you continue the journey.